Well, it's an old story, but it's a pretty good one. It's about a group of kindergartners who were busy drawing pictures. Their Sunday school teacher was making the rounds, admiring their artwork, when the picture of one small boy piqued her curiosity. And so she asked the little fellow what he was drawing. Without pausing to look up, he said, "A picture of God." The teacher smiled and replied, "You realize that nobody knows what God looks like." The boy carefully put down his crayon, looked her squarely in the eye, and declared, "They will when I'm done." It's called making God in our image, right? Did you bring a Bible with you today? Let's turn to Exodus 32, shall we? Since we're dealing with the golden calf, it just seemed proper to go with "Don't Have a Cow" for our title today. Turn to Exodus 32, the second book into the Old Testament, towards the back there of Exodus. It's where we'll be dropping anchor today. We're winding down in this study. It's a series we called Road Trip, Life Lessons from the book of Exodus. And just by way of review today, I think most of us would have to agree that things have been going rather smoothly overall for the children of Israel. I mean, they've been delivered from the oppression of Egyptian slavery. God has provided fresh manna every morning, even thrown in some occasional meat by way of quail on occasion, right? The Lord led them to Mount Sinai, where he entered into a covenant relationship with the nation and gave them instructions for the ark, for the tabernacle, for the consecration of priests. Things have been going pretty well overall. There's been some whining, there's been some grumbling along the way, but nothing all that serious. But all that is about to change. Things are going to go south in a hurry. That much is obvious even from studying the language that's used in this section. You see, the word sin has been used only 10 times in the book of Exodus to this point. But now, if you were to actually read these 3 chapters, Exodus 32 through 34, you would encounter that word or see the term sin 11 times in a span of just 3 chapters, which is pretty amazing if you stop and think about it, because the term has all but disappeared from the English language. Instead, our culture would prefer to say, well, I've made some mistakes, but nobody's perfect. Or I've occasionally slipped up, but God will understand. He grades on a curve, right? We have all sorts of euphemisms for the word we don't want to say, this word of sin. But the Bible addresses it very specifically. And so if you happen to pick up an outline on your way into the sanctuary today, you can track with me as we move through. Scripture's going to have a lot to say about sin in this section. 3 certainties today on that outline. If you want to fill in the blanks, jot down some references. We'll start here. Certainty number 1. Sin is a violation of God's directives. It's an outright rebellion against his commands. We'll pick it up at verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Fascinating. I mean, this is the same group of people, right? This is the same group who said in Exodus 19:8, "We will do everything that the Lord has said." When Moses told the people all the laws, all the words from God, again, they replied with one voice in Exodus 24:3, "Everything the Lord has said we will do." And then one more time, Exodus 24, verse 7, a short time later, "We will do everything the Lord has said we will obey." How soon we forget, right? Here in Exodus 32:1, the people grow impatient. Now, in fairness to them, there's no evidence that in his previous trips to the top of Mount Sinai that Moses had ever stayed overnight. Not only that, but the people had not been specifically told how long Moses would be gone. So what we're witnessing here is somewhat normal. It's hard for God's people to wait on him, right? I mean, the Bible tells us those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. That's true. But more often than not, we lose our patience while doing so. Too often we want instant gratification. And when God doesn't come through like we think he should, our whole belief system can become rattled. And that's what's happening here. And so the people decide to take matters into their own hands, right? They gather around Aaron, say, make us gods who will go before us. I think Aaron's participation in this escapade is probably the biggest head-scratcher in this whole account. Verse 2, Aaron answered them, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me. Some commentators have pointed out that phrase back in verse 1, where it says the people gathered around Aaron, some have pointed out that can actually be translated as the people ganged up on him. So I guess it's possible that Aaron is feeling some amount of pressure, maybe even fear from this unruly crowd. But it still bothers me that we don't see any kind of resistance in this passage. I mean, he could have at least reminded the pressure group that Moses had commanded them to wait for his return. That's what Moses said right before he left. And here's Aaron. I mean, this guy has just been appointed the first high priest of Israel. He's Moses' brother. He's been serving as co-leader of the Exodus. We would expect better. Verse 3, so all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Wait, what? Like, how in the world did we get here? Well, sin ignores God's commands. It disregards his laws. In this case, commands that were issued just a short time ago, right? The Ten Commandments. I mean, what part of you shall have no other gods before me? What part don't you understand there? What part is confusing? But it didn't end there either, did it? Not only were the Israelites insisting on breaking the first commandment, but they deliberately violated the second. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in heaven above, earth beneath, or water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. How do we know that idolatry was a big deal in God's sight? Well, it's the first subject matter that he addresses as he's issuing the law, right? And not only that, but these first two commandments are some of the longest in the Decalogue. Most of the other commandments are one phrase, but here an entire 6 verses are devoted to this theme, right out of the gate. We've already discussed idolatry in this series, and so it's no surprise that it surfaces again. If you were to do a search for the word idols, idolatry, it appears at least 111 times in the Old Testament alone. What is an idol? Well, an idol is anything in your life that takes the place of God. Anything that you let divert attention away from the primary objective, and that is to know God and to worship him. Martin Lloyd-Jones said it like this. He said, an idol is anything that attracts me so easily that I give my time, attention, and money to it effortlessly. How can you tell when something has become an idol in your life? Well, I think I figured it out. I gave this some thought and attention. I think I know how you can identify idols. And these things are all definitely idols, right? I mean, there's no question about that. Those things are all definitely idols. These are all, now, these things, not so much, okay? These things are definitely not. Okay, I'm messing with you just a little bit, right? It's easy to identify the idols in other people's lives, isn't it? I mean, see me after the service. I'll tell you what your idols are. But don't be pointing mine out to me. The reality is, it isn't hard to figure out. Because worshiping idols is costly. It requires time, energy, money, resources. So you want to identify your idols? Take a good hard look at your credit card statement, where your money's going. Or maybe pull out your day timer. Where are you investing your time, your energy? Or maybe scrutinize the topics on your computer search engine. It just got real quiet in here. There's a good chance that the Spirit of God can use those types of things to point out the idols in our lives. Sin is a violation of God's commands. Certainty number 2, sin is a repudiation of God's character. Not only had Aaron made an idol, but apparently he made a very good one, because you see it there at the tail end of verse 4. Then the people said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Think about that. I mean, this cow didn't exist 24 hours ago. And now it's getting credit for delivering them from Egypt? When Aaron saw this, verse 5, when Aaron saw how would you expect that sentence to end? When Aaron saw this, he came to his senses and shouted, "What have we done? We must destroy this abomination immediately." That's what you would expect, right? But instead, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there'll be a festival to the Lord," to Yahweh. I probably need to emphasize that technically Israel here isn't switching gods. They intend to worship the Lord. They've just decided to do it by means of this cow. You see, they wanted an image that represented Yahweh. Remember, they've only been out of Egypt for a few months. And prior to that, they'd been living in Egypt for 400 years. So everything about Egypt was normal to them, while everything about the Lord seemed kind of strange and unusual. Well, here they are in the middle of nowhere, supposedly with an invisible God who speaks to them, and yet they might die if they get too close. Their leader's up on the mountain, but they haven't heard from him recently. For all they know, he might have died in that thunderstorm, right? So what's the solution? What's the answer here? A tangible God. One that they can see, one they can touch. In Egypt, one of the representations in the pantheon of gods that were worshipped was a bull by the name of Apis. He was the symbol of strength and power, virility. And so what we have here is God's people patterning their style of worship after what they had seen and experienced in a pagan land. And again, in doing so, they broke another command. They broke the third commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. We just saw it right in verse 4. They said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." They declared this statue formed by human hands to be their God. How much more egregiously can you take the name of the Lord your God in vain than to take a statue you created with your own hands and call it God? I like what R.C. Sproul said here. He said, "The cow gave no law and demanded no obedience. It had no wrath or justice or holiness to be feared. It was deaf, dumb, and impotent. But at least it could not intrude on their fun and call them to judgment. This was a religion designed by men, practiced by men, and ultimately useless for men." Are you tracking with me today? In countless ways, the Israelites were rejecting God as God. What they're saying here is, "God, we don't like the way that you are. We don't like the fact that you're invisible. We want a God that we can see. You're too demanding. We want a God with fewer restrictions. We don't deny that you exist. We'll call you Yahweh. We'll have a feast to you, but we're going to worship you in the way that we want to worship you." And I suppose it would be real easy this morning to shake our heads and say, those silly Israelites. How incredibly rebellious. I can't believe after all that they've experienced in recent months that they're already making their own God. It'd be real easy for us to criticize, wouldn't it? But I would caution you from doing so. Because you see, all too often, I think we're guilty of the same thing. Here's the way Erwin Lutzer said it. He said, "Americans don't mind saying that they believe in God just as long as they get to define the God in whom they believe." He said, it's been said a million times, in the beginning, God created man in his own image, and we have been returning the favor ever since. And so we're constantly making images of God that are unworthy of him. We want to tear God down to manageable proportions. We want a God that we can control. We want a God who exists for us, not the kind of God for whom we exist. Recent research done by Barna revealed that the dominant worldview in America is now syncretism, chosen by 92% of American adults as their dominant philosophy of life. What in the world is syncretism? Well, that's where you have a customized blend of religions or philosophies. In other words, I'll take a belief from that religion, I'll take a belief from that philosophy, and I'll combine it over here with this, and I'm going to make my own God. I'm going to create my own religion, my own system of beliefs. And I don't know, gang, I don't know, but that sounds an awful lot to me like making a cow and bringing it over here and calling it Yahweh. Sounds real similar. Studies now reveal that only 4% of Americans, 6% of Christians have a biblical worldview. In other words, a belief system that matches, that lines up with what the Word of God truly teaches. It's astounding. But that's the world, that's the culture in which we live. Sin is a violation of God's commands. It's a repudiation of his commandments. Thirdly, certainty. Number 3, sin leads to a nullification of God's blessings. The things that God wants to pour out into our lives, the things that God wants to bless us with, we nullify because of our disobedience, because of our sinful actions. Let's see if that becomes clear. We'll pick it up at verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, go down because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol, cast in the shape of a calf. They bowed down to it, sacrificed to it, and said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Did you pick up on the pronouns there? I highlighted them so you wouldn't miss. Go down. God says, go down for your people, the ones that you brought up. Parents do that, don't they? One will turn to the other and said, do you know what your son did, right? You ever use that one? In doing this, God is not suggesting that he's no longer taking responsibility for them. That's not the point. No, he says this because the Israelites have rejected him. They said, the calf is our God. And so God responds, Moses, these people don't want me. They think this bull is their God. And this despite everything that the Lord had done for them. Can you see how this isn't just some minor misunderstanding? The issue here is one of complete lack of trust. They've rejected God. But wait, there's more. Look at this. Verse 6, so the next day the people rose up early. They couldn't wait. Couldn't wait to get started. We're willing to make sacrifices for our idols, aren't we? The next day they got up early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Back in the day, when pagans offered sacrifices on an altar in front of a god or idol, the thought was, in doing so, it guaranteed that the god would see the offerings made to them and accept those offerings. Twice in the book of Exodus, we have record of God's people gathering in some formal way for eating and drinking. The first was back in Exodus 24. Remember the situation there? They saw God and they ate and drank. Remember, that's the conclusion of the covenant renewal ceremony. We studied that. Where's the second occasion? Right here in verse 6. King James translates, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, just so you don't misunderstand, this wasn't some kind of Uno tournament, okay, where it says they got up to play. They weren't off in the corner, doing a Scrabble game. The NIV more accurately renders, afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. And so most commentators, not all, but most believe that what's going on here are pagan rituals, including orgies. But connect the dots there between those two passages. Exodus 24, now in Exodus 32. They're perverting the sacramental meal that they shared with Yahweh on the mountain and are now enjoying it with their so-called God. You get it? You see it there? Some commentators have compared this to a beautiful wedding ceremony where you publicly pledge your love and loyalty to your spouse, and then you go out and have an affair on your honeymoon. This type of behavior robs us of God's blessings. It nullifies the good things that He wants to do. And instead, we face judgment, right? And so to no one's surprise here, the hammer is about to fall. Verse 9, I've seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, they're a stiff-necked people. Leave me alone, so my anger may burn against them, that I might destroy them. And then Moses, I'm going to make you into a great nation. We saw earlier in Exodus that God's chosen people were a holy nation, a royal priesthood, His treasured possession. But now He gives them a new name. For the first time, it won't be the last, He calls them a stiff-necked people. When you wanted an animal to help with harvest or to help plow a field, you would put a yoke on its neck. But if your animal was stiff-necked, it would resist. It wouldn't bend its neck to have the yoke placed around it, rendering it useless. And so that's the image that God chooses here for His people. They refuse to wear their master's yoke. They were a people who never learned. They wouldn't listen. They wouldn't admit their mistakes. And so God threatens to wipe them all out and start over with Moses. Notice God didn't say He was going to do this. He was threatening to do it. And I believe part of the reason was this. He wants to incentivize Moses to start praying. And Moses does so. I know the font is small here, but I wanted to put the entire prayer on the screen so you could see it. Here's Moses' prayer. You can read down through that. You'll notice that Moses doesn't want the responsibility for these whiners, does he? And so he gives them right back to God. No, God, actually, they're your people, right? I didn't bring them out of Egypt. And notice, too, that the prayer was not so much for the people. No, it's centered on the honor and glory of God. Moses is concerned for the hit that God's reputation would take if God gave up on the Israelites and wiped them out. It would be a bad rap on God's name, on God's character. And so what does He do? He actually appeals to God's nature, and He remembers the covenant promises. God, remember what you told Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's how Moses prays here. Was it effective? Well, you be the judge. Verse 14, then the Lord relented and did not bring on His people the disaster that He had threatened. Some struggle with that word relented here. King James actually uses the word repented. We know elsewhere in the Scriptures that God doesn't change His mind. Numbers 23 and other places makes that clear. God doesn't change His mind. He's immutable. So what's happening here? We call this anthropomorphism. Write that down on your outline so that you can use it in your next Bible study and people will be impressed at your incredible insight into the Scriptures, okay? What's anthropomorphic language? It's when we try to understand God or describe God in human terms. He's so far beyond our comprehension that we take a human trait, a human quality, and we assign it to God just by the way of trying to understand. Here's the point. God is not changing His mind. He knew exactly what He was going to do. He makes a threat, not a decree to destroy, and it was that threat that inspired Moses to start praying. This was a rhetorical way of saying to Moses, here is what I will do unless you intervene. Shows us the power of prayer, doesn't it? We could just spend time on that topic alone in this passage. Thankfully, Moses did begin to pray. And then he went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands. Verse 19, when Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. Why did he do that? Well, it's symbolic, isn't it? He's literally breaking the stone tablets because in doing so, he's demonstrating that God's people had broken God's laws. It was a visual. Now watch this. This is great. He confronts Aaron. Moses, says to Aaron, what did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin? Don't be angry, my lord, Aaron answered. You know how prone these people, see how he disassociates himself, right? You know how prone these people, they said to me, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. So I told them, whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off. They gave me the gold, I threw it in the fire, and out popped this calf. That's the right reaction. That's the right reaction. You're laughing. I mean, this has got to rank up one of the lamest excuses in the entire Bible, right? Your 7-year-old could make up a better story than that one. Well, Moses isn't buying it. And what follows now is a series of escalating judgments. We'll move down through them quickly. Verse 20, Moses took the calf, burned it in the fire. Imagine it was made out of wood and probably overlaid with gold. He grinds it into powder, scatters it into their water supply so they would have to drink it. That's hardcore, isn't it? He wasn't messing around. I'm going to take your God, I'm going to grind him up, you're going to drink it. I want to make you sick of your sin. Some have pointed out, not to be crude today, but some have pointed out that in drinking it, their idol would eventually become their bodily waste. And that's what God thought of their idol. It's equivalent of body waste. He made them drink it. Kind of like I'd like a golden calf latte, please, right? Oh, wait. Actually, the calf was gone. I guess it would be a decaf latte, wouldn't it? Just saying. Just saying. Verse 25, Moses saw the people were running wild and that Aaron had let them get out of control, and so became a laughing stock to their enemies. And so he stood at the entrance to the camp and said, whoever's for the Lord, come to me. And all the Levites rallied to him. Then he said to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor. The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. Now, every indication here is that the 3,000 that were killed were the ones who determined to persist in their idolatry. They were given a chance, they were given a choice, but they wouldn't give it up. They were bent on their idolatrous ways. Final judgment comes in the last verse of the chapter, verse 35, and the Lord struck the people with a plague because of what they did with the calf that Aaron had made. These escalating judgments here at the end of this chapter. Now, to our 21st century American ears, those consequences might sound extreme, but here's the point. A serious disease calls for drastic action, doesn't it? Any qualified doctor is going to tell you that sometimes radical surgery is required. Remember where these people are in their history. They're a fledgling people group. They are a nation that has just been established. God cannot allow the cancer of idolatry to get a foothold and spread. It must be dealt with decisively. Serious disease calls for drastic action. But it's also a huge wake-up call for us today, isn't it? Because idolatry is not just an Old Testament problem. Idolatry is the number one sin issue throughout the entire Bible. Let me give you a quick taste of that as we wrap up today. Look what Paul wrote in Colossians 3. He said, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, things like sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. All those things, among others, can be labeled idolatry. Put them to death. Deal decisively. Requires drastic action. So in light of that, the appropriate question that we need to ask today is not, God, have I been guilty of idolatry? I think the more appropriate question is, God, where? Where have I been guilty of? Where am I being guilty of idolatry, right? Same emphasis in 1 Corinthians 10. where Paul writes this, "Now these things occurred to them as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and they got up to indulge in revelry." So you can see very clearly Paul has Exodus 32 in mind here, right? But now he's writing to the church. He's writing to believers. And he warns us about guarding our hearts from being led astray. And then he adds this just a short time later in that same chapter. These things happened to them as examples. Twice he says it. Pointing back to Exodus 32, he says, look at that text and let it be an example to you. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think that you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Bottom line this morning, idolatry is spiritual adultery. We're betraying God. We're breaking His heart. We're putting ourselves in the arms of other lovers. The reason that God has such a huge problem with this sin is because His love for you is all-consuming. God loves us so much, He loves you so much that He says, I want your heart. I want to be the most important thing in your life. That kind of possessive love shouldn't repulse us. On the contrary, it should make us feel secure and protected. God loves you way too much to share your devotion with someone or something else. So I was reflecting on this text and thinking about possible closing song. A phrase came to mind, give us clean hands, tear down our idols. Oh, this old Promise Keeper song. What is the name of that song? Did a Google search, came up with it. It was ready to suggest it to Kenny. I went to the order of service and found out that Kenny had already selected it, and it was the closing song for this morning. So I guess God was working on both of us this week. Let's make that our prayer. God, give us clean hands. Give us clean hearts. We want to tear down idols. We want to tear down anything that's going to interfere with your reign in our lives. Make it your prayer as we sing in closing. Will you stand as Kenny leads us?